Hello, my fellow penguins and friends from all over the world. Okay, today we're going to talk through Romans 7. And this, I think, is one of the biggest misunderstood chapters of the Bible possibly ever. There's more, I know. But this is a biggie because I have so many friends and believers that will say, see, Paul struggled with sin. This is just the battle of sin within, and it's just something I can't get away from. That is an absolute lie. I'm sorry to tell you. Actually, I'm thankful to tell you that's an absolute lie. So let's look at this contextually here. So in Romans 6, and Paul is leading up this beautiful case to his whole argument that in Christ, you're dead to sin. Before Christ, you couldn't do anything. You were a slave to it. When you accepted Christ, you became the new creation like we've talked about previously. And you are now dead to sin and actually freed from sin. You're no longer a slave to sin. Then Paul starts out in Romans 7. In the very beginning of it, he's talking about this marriage and the release of marriage through death. And it's hard to understand unless you understand that he's actually talking about covenantal language. He's referring to the Mosaic covenant. And in a covenant, there's only one way out of a covenant, and that's through death. And that means that when a death occurs by one of the covenant parties, then that covenant has been fulfilled. Very similar to a mortgage on your house that you have with the bank. It's a covenant contract that you are bound by law to repay that. And there's penalties if you don't do that. But when you pay that covenant off, it's called you have fulfilled that contract and you're no longer bound to it. So when Jesus died on the cross, when he died, he released the old covenant, right? You are no longer bound to that. And that's what that language is talking about. That when Jesus died, it released like in a marriage so that we are now free to marry another, which is the new covenant, which is Christ. So Christ died, which released us from the old Mosaic covenant and the law so that we could be free to marry another in the new covenant. It's awesome. So then when we get into Romans 7, verse 14, and starting through verse 14 and all the way through the end, Paul does this weird thing. It's like he goes backwards and starts talking about how he can't help but sin and that he's a slave to sin and all this. And what you've got to understand is he's actually using a literary term called the historical present in the Greek. This was fairly common in that era. We see this in Latin. We see this in some of the writings of Caesars at the time. And what it actually means is he is referring to his past life in the present tense to actually emphasize it. And what he is showing starting in verse 14 is that before his life in Christ, he couldn't do anything else. He wanted to do good things, but he was a slave to sin and couldn't do it. And what he's emphasizing is how powerless we are over sin outside of Christ, right? But here's the incredible thing, right? He goes from there to Romans 8, which I love the beginning of this. It says, therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. No condemnation for you as a believer in Christ, right? For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ from the law of sin and death. That is amazing, right? And then we get down to verse 9, Romans 8, verse 9, it says, you, however, are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. If in fact the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, although the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. So if you have accepted Christ, then Christ is inside of you, right? We saw that in Ephesians 1, and we saw in our placement in Ephesians 2. And so what this is saying is if you have accepted Christ, you are a new creation, set free from the law of sin and death. It no longer has mastery over you. Your nature is no longer a sinner nature. So it is actually unbiblical to say, I'm just a sinner saved by grace, just a wretch. That is an atrocity to the cross and what Jesus did on it. So when Paul says, renew your mind and have the mind of Christ, what he's saying, and actually in Romans 8 and 9 as well, is that understand who you are in Christ now. Right? I can choose to think of myself still as a wretched sinner, and you know what's going to happen? I'm actually going to behave like I believe, because I can only behave according to my belief. But if I actually understand what Christ says and what Paul says about who we are in Christ, and I understand that I'm actually a new creation in Christ, I now have the nature of Christ. Yes, I'm still going to mess some things up at times, but I am a saint who occasionally forgets who I am, and I begin to fall into the flesh and try to obey the flesh. But what Paul is saying is, you're no longer part of the flesh. You're no longer a slave to sin. So for those of you who struggle with habitual sin and struggle with that whole piece, am I not really a Christian because I still do these things? Forget it. You have authority in Christ, and that Christ has already overcome sin. That is not who I am anymore. I am a new creation, a son and a daughter of the King. I am a saint, and I have authority and dominion over that sin in your life today. You don't have to earn it. You can't earn it. Christ has already done everything for you. You simply have to change your mindset and understand who you are in Christ and walk according to who you are as a new creation. And you walk in authority and you walk in dominion. Man, when you get this, it will change your life, and you will walk in freedom and joy that Christ died for and rose again to new life. So thank you for listening, and I hope you guys have an amazing day and begin to walk more and more in the freedom and the fullness of Christ.